This story is going to change the way you see the world. It's going to challenge your mindset, make you rethink how people are judged, and open your eyes to a harsh truth about society. But most importantly, it's going to show you why respect is worth more than money. Stay till the end. You won't regret it. And if you want more eye-opening stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get into it. Would you judge a man by his clothes? This manager did, and it cost him everything. The showroom gleamed like a palace, its spotless white marble floors stretching endlessly, reflecting the brilliance of the overhead lights. Glass walls showcased a pristine world of high-end sports cars, lined up like untouchable masterpieces. The kind of place where millionaires indulged in extravagant purchases simply because they could. And then there was him. Malcolm pushed open the heavy glass door, his entrance causing an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. His boots, caked with dried mud from hours spent tending his farm, left faint traces on the immaculate floor. His flannel shirt, damp with sweat from the relentless afternoon sun, stood in stark contrast to the showroom's polished elegance. His frayed jeans bore the marks of years of hard labor. The air was thick with the scent of leather and cologne, yet Malcolm carried something different. The subtle fragrance of fresh soil and open country air, a scent that seemed utterly foreign in this space. A few salesmen cast quick glances before returning to their conversations. A couple admiring an electric blue sports car turned, their eyes flicking over him before whispering among themselves. And then there was Brad Simmons. The showroom manager had been leaning against the front desk, laughing at something on his phone. But the moment Malcolm stepped inside, his demeanor shifted. His jaw tightened, his lips thinned, and his gaze swept over Malcolm like he was an unwelcome guest in a world where he didn't belong. Malcolm had barely taken a few steps before Brad moved in, cutting him off. "Sir," Brad said, his voice laced with forced politeness, "can I help you with something?" Unbothered, Malcolm let his eyes wander around the showroom. "Yeah," he said. "I was hoping to take a look at the new limited edition model. Heard you had one in stock." Brad exhaled sharply, almost amused. His eyes flickered over Malcolm's dirt-streaked clothes, rough hands, and faded cap, barely concealing his skepticism. "We don't exactly do test drives for just anyone," Brad said, tilting his head slightly. His voice carried a subtle edge, a thinly veiled dismissal wrapped in forced politeness. "This isn't the kind of place where you, just browse." Malcolm lifted a brow slightly at that. "That's so." Brad folded his arms, his smirk widening just enough to make it clear he was enjoying this. "Maybe you'd have better luck at one of the dealerships across town," he continued, his tone carrying the same condescending amusement. "They've got a solid selection of used trucks." Malcolm remained still, his expression unreadable. But before he could say a word, the glass door swung open with a quiet hiss, a rush of cool air briefly swirling in from outside. Another customer had entered, but Brad didn't turn to acknowledge them. His entire focus remained locked on Malcolm, his posture stiff, as if ensuring that Malcolm didn't take another step deeper into the showroom. Malcolm exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had spent years dealing with men like Brad, different faces, same attitude. He had half a mind to turn around and walk out, to leave the showroom and let the man bask in his own arrogance. But something inside him told him to stay. "I'm not looking for a used truck," Malcolm said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I came here for a reason." Brad let out a short chuckle under his breath, shaking his head slightly, like he had heard this before, like he had seen this scenario play out 100 times. He had already made his judgment, and nothing Malcolm said was going to change it. "Sir," Brad said, drawing out the word as if it took effort, "this is a luxury dealership." His smirk deepened, his voice dripping with condescension. "Our clientele is selective." He let the word hang between them, making sure the implication landed exactly as he intended. A few feet away, a younger salesman, mid-20s, sharp suit, nervous energy, shifted uncomfortably where he stood. He had been watching the exchange, glancing between Malcolm and Brad, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. He looked as if he wanted to say something, to step in, but hesitation held him back. Malcolm reached up, adjusting his cap slightly, never breaking eye contact with Brad. Selective, huh? His voice was calm, measured, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Brad didn't flinch. His smirk didn't fade. That's right. The tension in the room thickened, stretching across the showroom like an invisible rope, pulled tighter and tighter with each passing second. A woman inspecting a sleek silver sports car with her husband turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the interaction before quickly looking away, pretending not to notice. Malcolm sighed, shoving his calloused hands into his pockets. His fingers curled slightly inside them, not in anger, but in recognition. This wasn't new. This wasn't surprising. You know, he said, shaking his head slightly, I've worked hard my whole life, built something from the ground up. And the funny thing about money, he let out a short, knowing chuckle. It doesn't always dress the way you expect it to. Brad's expression barely flickered. If anything, the amusement in his eyes deepened. I'm sure that's true, he said, his tone remaining smooth, controlled, uninterested. But our customers don't usually track dirt into the showroom. His gaze flicked downward, landing on Malcolm's boots, then just as quickly rising back up. His smirk remained, his posture unchanged, his meaning unmistakable. So unless you're here for something realistic, he continued, waving a lazy hand toward the exit, I don't want to waste your time. The younger salesman shifted again, this time inhaling sharply as if preparing to speak. But before he could, Brad shot him a sharp look, one that sent a clear message, stay out of it. The young man hesitated, his mouth parting slightly, but the words never came. Instead, he looked down, pressing his lips into a thin line. Malcolm let out a short laugh, a low, knowing sound that came not from humor, but from understanding. He had expected this. It wasn't the first time. It probably wouldn't be the last. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the air behind them. Hey, Dad. Sorry I took so long. Brad Simmons froze mid-expression. The smug confidence that had been so firmly in place just moments ago faltered, his jaw tightening as he slowly turned his head toward the voice. The man who had just walked in was the definition of polished perfection. A tailored navy suit hugged his frame flawlessly, paired with a crisp white shirt that looked as if it had never seen a wrinkle. A sleek designer watch gleamed under the bright showroom lights, catching the reflection just right. Everything about him, the way he carried himself, the effortless confidence in his stride, commanded attention. He wasn't the type to ask people to move aside. They just did. Jared. Malcolm gave a small nod, his face unreadable. You're late. Jared chuckled, unfazed. Yeah, got caught up with some last-minute calls. He closed the distance between them, clapping Malcolm on the shoulder with the kind of ease that spoke of years of familiarity. It was casual, natural, an unspoken understanding passing between them. And then, Jared's sharp gaze flicked toward Brad. The shift in the room was immediate. The thick, lingering tension from before didn't just fade. It snapped like a rope cut clean in two. But what replaced it wasn't relief. It was something far more unsettling. Panic. Brad blinked rapidly, his mouth parting slightly as if words had abandoned him. He was struggling to process what he had just witnessed, his brain scrambling to piece together something that didn't make sense. His eyes darted between Malcolm and Jared, searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything that could explain away the sinking realization forming in his gut. The man he had just dismissed, the man he had mocked, the man he had tried to usher out of the showroom like an unwanted guest, was Jared's father. A misunderstanding. Malcolm, the man Brad had just dismissed as some broke farmer who had wandered in by accident, was Jared's father. Jared frowned slightly, his sharp gaze moving from Brad to Malcolm. I see you've already met my dad. His voice was casual, but there was an unmistakable edge creeping in, something cold and dangerous beneath the surface. Brad opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The younger salesman, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort, suddenly found a reason to check something on his clipboard, avoiding eye contact entirely. A deep, suffocating silence settled over the showroom, stretching unbearably. A few customers, sensing that something significant was unfolding, subtly repositioned themselves to listen in, pretending to browse, but keeping their ears trained on the conversation. Brad finally managed to force words past his lips, but they came out weak and uncertain. I didn't realize. Jared tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Didn't realize what exactly? Brad swallowed hard, his throat working as he tried to find the right words. I mean, I didn't know he was rich. Jared cut him off, his tone now completely void of warmth. Brad flinched, visibly shrinking under Jared's piercing stare. Malcolm remained silent, simply watching. Jared stepped closer to Brad, his eyes never leaving him. So let me get this straight, he said slowly, as if piecing things together in real time. You saw a black man walk in here, wearing work clothes, and instead of treating him like a paying customer, you decided he didn't belong? Brad opened his mouth again, then shut it just as quickly. His carefully polished confidence had completely crumbled. Jared let the silence drag, the weight of his words settling over the room like a storm cloud. Then, without taking his eyes off Brad, he turned to his father. Did he even let you see the car? Malcolm shook his head. Didn't get that far. Jared exhaled sharply, turning back to Brad with something bordering on disgust. This is interesting, he said, his voice deceptively calm. Because I was planning on buying 3 cars today. Cash. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the background. Even the other employees, who had been doing their best to pretend they weren't paying attention, stiffened at the revelation. Brad's face drained of color. Jared adjusted his cuff, his eyes still locked onto Brad's. But now, he said, voice smooth and cutting, I think I'll take my business somewhere else. Brad physically jolted like someone had kicked the back of his knees. Wait, Mr. Carter. Jared lifted a hand, stopping him cold. No, you had your chance. Brad looked around, almost desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back him up, to help salvage the disaster he had created. But the younger salesman had suddenly become very busy inspecting a car's price tag, and the other employees? They knew better than to get involved. Malcolm smirked slightly, adjusting his cap. Guess we'll get those cars somewhere else. Jared turned to him with a nod. Yeah, somewhere that actually deserves our money. And just like that, they turned and headed for the door. But Brad wasn't done yet. His breath hitched as he watched Malcolm and Jared walk away. His mind raced. He had to fix this fast. Wait, he blurted out, stepping forward. Mr. Carter, please, let's talk about this. The arrogance was gone. Now, his voice was laced with something else. Desperation. Jared didn't even slow down. But Malcolm did. Just before reaching the exit, he paused, turning slightly to lift an eyebrow. Talk about what exactly? Brad hurried to close the gap between them, forcing an awkward, ingratiating smile. This was a misunderstanding, he said, his voice suddenly coated in fake warmth. I had no idea you were family. Jared scoffed, shaking his head. Family. He turned to face Brad fully now, his expression unreadable, but his stance, his tone, and the fire in his eyes spoke volumes. Crossing his arms, Jared fixed Brad with a hard stare. So, if he wasn't my father, you'd still be throwing him out? Brad froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Jared let it hang there, his expression unreadable. See, that's the problem, he continued, stepping closer. You don't treat people with respect. You treat money with respect. And if you don't see money on someone, you act like they don't matter. Brad's face flushed deep red. His fingers twitched at his sides, as if grasping for something. Anything to say. That's not what I meant, he finally stammered, his voice uneven. Jared wasn't interested in excuses. His gaze bore into Brad's. So tell me, Brad, how long have you been doing this? How many people have you turned away just because they didn't look rich enough? Brad opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The air in the showroom had become unbearably thick. Employees had stopped pretending to work. Customers stood frozen in place, some holding their phones as if to scroll, but they weren't paying attention to their screens. They were eavesdropping, waiting to see how this unfolded. Malcolm watched Brad carefully, taking in the panic settling behind his eyes. He had seen this type of man before. The self-appointed gatekeepers who decided who was worthy and who wasn't based on appearances alone. He shook his head slowly. "You know," Malcolm said, his voice calm but carrying undeniable weight. "I've been in places like this before. Walked into restaurants, hotels, dealerships. I've seen that same look you gave me 100 times." He let his words linger before adding, "It's funny, though. The same people who turn their noses up at me always change their tune once they realize what's in my bank account." Brad swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. His entire demeanor had shifted from arrogant to desperate. Jared took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the words cut deep. "Here's what's going to happen, Brad. You're going to watch us walk out that door, and you're going to remember this moment the next time you judge someone by their clothes instead of their character." Brad's eyes darted toward Malcolm, pleading, "Sir, please, But Malcolm had already turned away, and just like that, the biggest sale of Brad's career walked right out the door. Yet the consequences were just beginning. The heavy glass door swung shut behind Malcolm and Jared, leaving behind a silence, so thick it might as well have been concrete. Inside the showroom, the weight of what had just happened settled over everyone like an immovable force. Jared exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel as he stared out at the road ahead. "This kind of thing happens way too often," he muttered. "People like Brad, they don't even realize what they're doing half the time. It's just how they operate, treating people like they don't belong unless they fit some stupid stereotype of what wealth looks like." Malcolm nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, and that's the problem, son. It's not just about Brad. It's about a system, a mindset, one that's been around a long, long time." He adjusted his cap, leaning back in his seat. "The real question is, how do you change it?" Jared flexed his fingers against the steering wheel, thinking. "I don't know," he admitted. "I mean, we just made an example out of him. Maybe the other employees in there learned something. Maybe the customers who saw it will think twice about where they spend their money. But does it really change anything in the long run?" Malcolm gave a small chuckle. "You'd be surprised what one moment can do." He glanced at his son, his expression thoughtful. "You think that young salesman in there is ever going to let something like that slide again? You think those customers won't go home and tell people what they saw? Every ripple turns into a wave, son." Jared considered that for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, maybe you're right." His fingers drummed against the leather of the steering wheel. "Still, it's frustrating. You shouldn't have to prove yourself just to get basic respect." Malcolm let out a slow breath, staring out the window. "No, you shouldn't," he agreed. "But life ain't fair. Never has been. You just got to decide how you're going to deal with it. Me? I don't waste time being bitter. I just make sure I carry myself in a way that demands respect, whether they want to give it or not." Jared glanced over at him, a small smirk pulling at his lips. "And if that doesn't work, I guess buying 3 cars in cash is a good way to make a statement." Malcolm chuckled. "That too." The SUV rumbled to life as Jared pulled out of the dealership lot, leaving the gleaming showroom and its stunned employees behind. Inside, Brad sat stiffly in a chair across from Mr. Langford, his hands gripping the edges of his knees. The older man stared at him in silence for a long moment, then finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You do realize what you just did, right?" Langford's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Brad swallowed hard. "Sir, Langford held up a hand. "I don't want excuses, Brad. You just lost this dealership sale worth over $200,000. And that's just today. Who knows how much business we've lost because of you that we'll never even hear about." Brad's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean—" "No." Langford cut him off sharply. "You didn't think. That's the problem. And now, I have to decide what to do about it." Brad opened his mouth, then closed it, his heart pounding. He already knew what was coming. Outside, as the SUV merged onto the highway, Malcolm glanced over at his son. "So, where are we headed now?" Jared smirked. "Somewhere that actually deserves our business." Malcolm chuckled. "Good call." And with that, they drove forward, leaving Brad and his mistakes in the rearview mirror. Malcolm nodded slowly, rubbing his palms together. "Yeah, but people like that, they always show themselves. The world has a way of humbling a man who thinks he's above others." Jared pulled out of the parking lot, his grip firm on the wheel. Still, I don't like seeing you treated that way. Malcolm gave him a knowing glance. Son, I've been treated that way long before you were even born. Jared exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel a little tighter. He hated that, hated how normal this was for his father, how easily he accepted it. They drove in silence for a moment, the city rolling past in a blur. Then Malcolm spoke again. You know what the best part of today was? Jared arched an eyebrow. What? Malcolm smirked. Watching him beg. Jared burst out laughing, shaking his head. All right, that was satisfying. Malcolm chuckled too, his shoulders shaking slightly. But then his expression grew serious. Listen, he said, his voice steady. You handled it the right way. You let him dig his own grave, then you buried him with his own words. You didn't yell, didn't lose your temper. You let the truth speak for itself. Jared nodded, letting the words settle in. He had wanted to get angry, to really let Brad have it, but in the end, Malcolm was right. The truth had done all the work. After a beat, Malcolm added, That's how you really teach people a lesson. Not by arguing, by making them face the weight of their own mistakes. Jared thought about that as they turned onto the highway. The dealership was already fading into the distance, but the lesson? That would stick. So, he asked, glancing over at his father, where to now? Malcolm grinned, stretching out his legs. Someplace where the salesmen actually know how to do their jobs. Jared chuckled. You got it, old man. As they drove off, the luxury dealership became just another place in the rearview mirror, a place that had lost more than just a big sale that day. Because respect? That's something money can't buy. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before people even knew who you were? Or seen someone else treated unfairly just because they didn't look the part? It happens more than we think. And the only way to change it is to call it out when we see it. Treat people with respect, not because of what they have, but because of who they are. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep the conversation going. Because at the end of the day, character matters more than status.